I left my husband. After 10 years of adventure and never-ending moving. Best decision ever. I was 35 years old when I realized I didn't own a single thing that couldn't be packed into a car in under an hour. I don't mean that in a minimalist, Instagram aesthetic way. I mean that I literally kept my life in a half-unpacked state because there was no point in settling in. Every time I opened a box, I did it with this quiet, gnawing thought. Don't get too comfortable. You'll be taping this shut again in 6 months. By that point, my husband and I had been married 10 years and had moved 25 times. 25. New apartments, new sublets, different cities, different countries. The first few moves had felt like an adventure, like we were two clever underdogs gaming the system, chasing opportunity, chasing freedom, chasing this hazy idea of financial independence my husband loved to talk about. But by move 25, it didn't feel like chasing anything. It felt like running from something I didn't have the courage to name. My husband, let's call him Mark, was the visionary. That's how I thought of him anyway. He was a software developer and serial entrepreneur, always with a new business idea, a new scheme, a new angle. He could walk into a coffee shop and come out with 3 opportunities. He was charming, intense, a little manic when he got excited. He could talk for hours about leverage, passive income, systems, the tyranny of the 9 to 5. When I met him, I was working in food service. Long hours, terrible pay, permanently sore feet. I knew how to manage a kitchen, how to plate a dish, how to survive a Friday night rush. But I'd never thought of myself as ambitious. I certainly didn't think of myself as business-minded. Then I met this man who looked at me like I was brilliant, who told me again and again that I was capable of so much more, who sketched out our future on napkins. We'd build location-independent businesses, make money while we slept, live wherever we wanted. We wouldn't be chained to offices or bosses or commutes. We'd be free. I fell in love with him, but I also fell in love with that story. And for a while, it kind of worked. He had a high-paying professional career he could dip into whenever we needed money. He'd take a 6-month contract, make a small fortune, and we'd use that runway to build businesses, online ventures, side hustles, whatever looked promising. When one idea died, another appeared. We bounced from city to city, chasing better prospects or cheaper rents, or sometimes just a change of scenery. In that strange, unstable decade, I reinvented myself too. I started writing. At first, it was just on the side, little stories, experiments. Then I discovered self-publishing, and for a while it was like catching lightning in a bottle. I wrote fast, published fast, learned marketing on the fly. Some months I pulled in mid-5 figures. Other months I earned a couple hundred, feast or famine. We lived that way for years. On paper, we looked like a scrappy, entrepreneurial couple chasing a dream. In reality, the dynamic was quieter and more complicated. His earning potential dwarfed mine. He could walk into a 6-figure job in a matter of weeks. I could pick up another restaurant job or try to squeeze more books out of an already exhausted brain. So when money got low, the unspoken plan was always the same. He'd go back to work for a while. Then we'd reset and try again. It was thrilling in its way. I'd never had anyone believe in me the way he did. I'd never believed in myself that way. But the cost was everything else. We never had a wedding. We bought my wedding band 3 years after we got married, because there was always something more important than rings. I cut my own hair. I wore the same stretched-out sweatpants year after year. I never decorated anywhere we lived, because why bother? We'd be gone soon. I told myself I didn't care about that stuff, that I was above it, that I was a big-picture person now. But somewhere around our 10th anniversary, the story started to fray. It began with something so ordinary, it almost feels ridiculous to name it. I wanted a place to put a fish tank. I remember standing in yet another bland furnished rental, staring at a blank wall. I imagined a little aquarium there. Just a simple one, with a few fish, maybe some plants. The kind you have to actually be present to take care of. You can't pack up a fish tank and move it across 3 time zones on a whim. I wanted that anchor, that tiny, mundane commitment to staying put. I wanted my cats back, too. They were living with my parents overseas because our life had become too unstable to keep them. Every time I video called my parents and saw those cats weaving around their ankles, I felt this sharp ache. I'd traded fur and purring and warm, heavy bodies on my lap for airport lounges and short-term leases. I wanted to unpack all my boxes and stop saving the cardboard. I wanted stability. Not a white picket fence, not suburbia, not a perfect Instagram home. Just the ability to exhale and believe I'd still be in the same bed, in the same room, in 6 months. When I tried to explain this to Mark, he said the line that would echo in my head for years: if you want those things, then make them happen. At first, I thought that was fair, empowering even. He wasn't saying no, he was saying, you're not a passenger in your own life. You want something? Go get it. But there was an edge to it. A subtext. Don't look at me to do it. I'm done being the one who makes the boring stuff happen. I started running mental simulations. If I were single, how would I build a stable life? What job would I get? How much would I need to earn? Where would I live? Every time I played that game, I felt 2 things. A flicker of excitement and a wave of guilt, because I wasn't single. I was married. And the version of my life where I was stable and grounded and rooted, it didn't really seem to include him. At that point, though, I didn't let myself follow that thought all the way through. I focused on the immediate crisis, money. His burnout had become impossible to ignore. The last job he took, the one that was supposed to be our next rebuilding phase, he quit after a single day. One day, he came home pale and shaky, his shoulders up around his ears. He talked about the open plan office, the pointless meetings, the feeling of his life being siphoned away in fluorescent light. I can't do it, he said. I really can't. I thought I could, but I can't. Our savings were dwindling, not the emergency rock bottom fund we never touched, but the buffer we actually lived off. I watched the numbers go down month after month and felt my chest tighten. So I did what I'd always done when things got scary. I took on more work. This time, though, it wasn't another creative hustle or side project. It was a job. A regular job. A 9-to-5, Monday to Friday, show up and get paid job. And it changed everything. I still remember the first morning I walked into that office. I'd been braced for the worst. Drudgery, boredom, that sense of being trapped I'd heard my husband describe so many times. Instead, I felt relief. There was a desk with my name on it. A computer that stayed in one place. A schedule. A team of people who expected me to be there next week, and the week after, and the week after that. No one asked me to be a visionary. No one expected me to build a business from scratch. My job was clear, my tasks were finite, and at the end of every month, a paycheck appeared in my account. Predictable, reliable. 95% of our bills covered, like clockwork. I was good at it, too. That surprised me. I'd spent so long thinking of myself as this scrappy, self-employed outsider that I'd forgotten I had other skills. I organized, I problem-solved, I built rapport with customers and coworkers. For the first time in years, I left work at work and came home with mental space left over. The stability of it did something to me. It was like being chronically dehydrated and suddenly discovering water. I hadn't realized how thirsty I was until I started to drink. At home, though, that shift created a crack. When we were both working from home, we'd been in this little bubble. Coffee together in the morning, shared lunches, midday walks. Our stress was mutual. Our chaos was shared. Now I left him alone all day, while I went off into a world he despised. At first, I tried to bring him into it. I'd come home and tell him about the funny thing my coworkers said, or the way my manager had praised a project I did. I actually like it, I told him one evening, kicking off my shoes. I know that sounds weird, but it feels good to know what I'm doing tomorrow, to know I can pay the rent next month. He gave me a tight smile. I'm glad you're happy, he said, but his eyes were distant. He'd sold one of his online businesses a few months earlier and was between projects. That had always been our pattern. Sell, regroup, reinvent. Only this time, the reinvention wasn't coming. He'd spend hours scrolling, researching, getting half excited about one idea, then discarding it the next day. Meanwhile, I was quietly falling in love with my own competence. There was a moment, about 3 months into the job, when I sat down to pay our bills. I opened the spreadsheet, entered my paycheck amount, and watched the numbers line up. Rent, covered. Utilities, covered. Groceries, covered. Savings contribution, small but real. I realized, with a jolt, that my income, my job, was carrying us. Not just supplementing his, not just tiding us over between his big wins. I was the primary earner. For the first time in our entire relationship, *I* was the financial rock. I expected to feel resentment. Instead, I felt a rush of pride. I was doing the thing I'd never believed I could do. I was making our life happen. But that pride came with a new clarity. Because once I knew I could support us, the mental game I'd been playing. What would I do if I were single? Stopped being hypothetical. I started noticing all the ways we were different. Not the cute, quirky differences you laugh about early in a relationship, but the deep, structural ones. I wanted to buy a small flat in the city. Nothing fancy, just a place of our own where I could paint the walls and hang pictures and, yes, maybe get that fish tank. Somewhere I could get to work on the bus, where I could walk to a cafe and become a regular. He wanted to move to the country, or travel, or live remotely, somewhere cheap and exotic, where we could stretch our money and he could figure things out without the pressure of rent in a major city. I wanted to make friends. Real friends. The kind you invite over for dinner more than once. The kind whose kids you watch grow up. The kind who notice when you're missing from trivia night. He shrugged whenever I brought it up. We'll make friends wherever we are, he'd say. We always do. But we didn't. Not really. We had acquaintances, other drifters we'd orbit for a while before the next move scattered us again. I wanted to decorate our home. To buy a rug because I liked how it felt under my feet. To hang framed photos. To put up fairy lights that served no purpose other than to make me smile. He saw all of that as clutter. It's just stuff, he'd say. Why waste money on things we'll have to move again? I wanted to talk about the future in terms of years, not months. He wanted to keep his options open. We had always framed these differences as complementary. He was the dreamer, I was the pragmatist. He pushed us to take risks. I made sure we didn't fall on our faces. But now, with my own footing finally secure, those differences didn't feel cute anymore. They felt like fault lines. One night, after a long day at work, I came home to find him at the kitchen table, laptop open, a dozen tabs cluttering the screen. He was looking at flights to South America. "What's this?" I asked, dropping my bag. He turned the screen toward me, eyes shining in that way I used to find irresistible. "I found this town," he said. "It's cheap. It's beautiful. The internet's decent. We could live there for a fraction of what we pay here. You could write full-time again. I could buy a couple of small online businesses, rebuild. We'd have so much freedom." I stared at the screen. The photos were gorgeous. Cobblestone streets, colorful houses, lush hills in the distance. It was the kind of place we'd fantasized about in our 20s. "I just started this job," I said carefully. "I like it. I'm good at it. And we're finally getting close to being able to buy a place." He waved a hand. "Jobs are everywhere. You could get another one there, or we could live off less. Imagine waking up and not having to go to an office. Imagine." "I don't want to imagine," I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. "I like my office. I like my coworkers. I like knowing I'll be in the same place in a year." He flinched. "You've changed," he said quietly. I opened my mouth to argue, then closed it. Because he was right. I had changed. For years, I'd been so focused on supporting his dreams that I didn't notice I had dreams of my own beyond help him succeed. I'd told myself I didn't care about stability, but the truth was, I'd never had the opportunity to choose it. Now that I did, I wanted it with a ferocity that scared me. He, on the other hand, had not changed. He still wanted what he'd always wanted: freedom, flexibility, the ability to walk away from anything that felt confining. He still believed that trading time for money in a traditional job was a kind of death. We sat there, staring at each other across the table, the unspoken realization hanging between us. We were no longer aligned. Maybe we never had been. "I thought this was our dream," he said finally. "To be free. To never be stuck in one place, doing the same thing, day in and day out." "It was your dream," I said, my throat tight. "I borrowed it because I didn't know I was allowed to have my own." The words slipped out before I could stop them. They hung in the air, shocking both of us. He leaned back, eyes narrowing. "So what? Now you want a mortgage, and a 9 to 5, and dinner parties with the neighbors?" "Yes," I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice was. "I think I do." He laughed once, bitterly. "You used to make fun of people like that." "No," I said softly. "You did. I just didn't argue." He stared at me like I'd grown another head. "So you're what? Giving up? Settling? Throwing away everything we worked for?" I wanted to scream that I was the one working, that I was the one paying the bills, that I was the one coming home exhausted and still doing the dishes. Instead, I took a breath. "I'm choosing something different," I said. "For me." The conversation spiraled from there. Old resentments surfaced. He accused me of abandoning our shared vision. I pointed out that shared implied we both had equal say in it, which had never really been true. He insisted he couldn't go back to a regular job, that it would destroy him. I said I couldn't keep living like a permanent tourist in my own life. We went to bed that night on opposite sides of the mattress, backs turned, a yawning silence between us. Over the next few months, we tried to patch things up. We had the same conversation in different words dozens of times. We talked about compromise. Maybe we'd stay put for a couple of years, then do a 6-month stint abroad. Maybe we'd rent instead of buying, so we'd have more flexibility. Maybe he'd find a way to freelance that didn't burn him out. But underneath every maybe was a truth we were both avoiding. Our core values didn't match. He saw his time as the most precious resource he had, and any job that required him to trade a significant chunk of it for money felt like a betrayal of himself. I understood that, intellectually. I even admired it in a way. But I also saw stability, roots, community, a sense of place, as precious. I saw a regular paycheck as a tool, not a prison. I didn't want to live on the edge of financial ruin in the name of freedom. The more I leaned into my job, my routines, my desire for a home, the more he pulled away. He started making little digs about my corporate mindset, about how I was thinking like an employee now. I started resenting how much time he spent chasing the next big idea while I kept our life afloat. We stopped laughing as much. We stopped touching as much. We stopped feeling like a team. One weekend, about 9 months after I'd started working, he went away on a long-planned trip, just a few days to visit a friend in another city. Nothing dramatic. I drove him to the airport, kissed him goodbye, watched him disappear into security. Then I got back in the car and felt light. I went home to our apartment. I made myself a simple dinner, just what I liked, no negotiations. I watched a show he hated. I left my book open on the couch and my mug on the coffee table, without worrying someone would complain about clutter. The silence was peaceful, not the brittle silence of tension, but the soft, spacious quiet of being alone with myself. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight spilling across the bed. His side was empty. I stretched out, feeling the cool sheets under my legs, and realized my jaw wasn't clenched. My shoulders weren't hunched. I made coffee and drank it slowly at the kitchen table, looking around at the half-decorated, half-temporary space we called home. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine what this apartment would look like if it were mine alone. Plants on the windowsill, art on the walls, a rug I'd chosen without compromise, a cat tree in the corner. I imagined coming home from work every day to that space, to my things, arranged how I liked, to quiet that didn't feel like walking on eggshells. The thought was intoxicating and terrifying, because once you let yourself imagine a different life, the one you're living starts to look less like the only option and more like a choice. I spent that weekend doing absolutely nothing remarkable. I went for a walk in the neighborhood and noticed how the light fell on the buildings, how the trees arched over the sidewalks. I chatted with the barista at the coffee shop on the corner and realized she recognized me. "The usual?" she asked, and my heart flipped at the idea that I had a usual. I called my parents and talked to my mom about her garden, my dad about his crossword obsession. I listened to my cat's meow in the background and felt that old ache again. But this time, it was accompanied by something else, the faint outline of a plan. I could have a life here, a real life, with routines and neighbors and a favorite bar and a library card. And maybe, one day, my cat's back with me. And the stark, ugly truth was that every time I pictured that life, Mark wasn't in it. When he came home, sunburned and buzzing with stories from his trip, I hugged him and felt off, like I was playing a role in a play I no longer believed in. He didn't notice at first. He launched into tales of the people he'd met, the remote working communities he'd discovered, the cheap rent in the city he'd visited. "We could live there for half of what we pay here," he said. "You could quit your job, go back to writing full-time. I could." "I don't want to move," I said. He stopped mid-sentence. "What?" "I don't want to move," I repeated. My voice was calm, but my heart was pounding. "I like it here. I like my job. I like this city. I want to stay." He stared at me for a long moment, then shook his head. "You don't mean that. You're just tired. You've been working too much. Once you take a break, you'll remember why we chose this life." I looked at him and realized he didn't see me. Not the me I was becoming, anyway. He saw the version of me who had happily followed him from city to city, who had absorbed his worldview until she couldn't tell where his dreams ended and hers began. He saw the supporting character in his story. And I didn't want that role anymore. The next few weeks were a blur of arguments, tears, late-night conversations that circled the same drain. He accused me of betrayal. I accused him of selfishness. We both said things we regretted. We tried counseling. The therapist was kind and insightful, and for a few sessions, it felt like maybe we could bridge the gap. But every time we got down to the core issues, stability versus freedom, community versus constant movement, security versus risk, we hit the same wall. "I feel like you're asking me to be someone I'm not," he said in one session, his voice raw. "You're asking me to go to an office every day and be okay with it. I can't. I feel like you're asking me to never unpack," I said. "To live my whole life in transition, waiting for the next move, the next idea, the next big thing that may or may not work. I can't do that anymore, either." The therapist gently pointed out that sometimes love isn't enough, that sometimes two good people with genuine affection for each other are simply incompatible in the ways that matter most. I cried all the way home from that session. I didn't want to be incompatible. I wanted us to be the exception, the couple that figured it out, the couple that balanced dreams and reality, that turned chaos into an adventure worth telling. But when I was honest with myself, I knew we'd already tried that. For 10 years, we'd given it everything we had, and I was so tired. The decision, when it finally crystallized, didn't come with a dramatic fight or a slammed door. It came one quiet evening when he was out, and I was sitting alone on the couch, staring at our half-unpacked bookshelf. I imagined my life in 5 years if nothing changed. More moves, more half-finished projects, more late nights worrying about money, more feeling like I was too much and not enough, all at once. More of my own needs shelved in favor of his next big idea. Then I imagined my life in 5 years if I left. I didn't picture a new partner or some grand romance. I pictured a small apartment with art on the walls, a group of friends I saw regularly, a job I didn't hate. Maybe a different job by then, something more aligned with my passions, but still, stable. I pictured a cat curled up on my lap while I read on a Sunday afternoon. I pictured peace. The contrast was so stark it took my breath away. I realized that staying wasn't just about love or loyalty. It was about fear. Fear that I couldn't make it on my own. Fear that I was being selfish. Fear that I was giving up on something that could be great if I just tried harder. But I was already supporting us. I was already doing the hard things. I was already, quietly, proving to myself that I could stand on my own feet. The only thing I hadn't done yet was admit that I wanted to. A week later, I told him I wanted a divorce. He laughed at first. He thought I was bluffing, trying to shock him into changing. When he realized I was serious, the laughter died. "You'll regret this," he said. "You're just going through a phase. You'll realize what you've thrown away, and you'll come back. I didn't yell. I didn't list all the ways I'd compromised, all the times I'd moved for him, all the jobs I'd taken to support his dreams. I just said, I don't think I will. The first few weeks after he moved out were surreal. There was paperwork, logistics, dividing up our meager belongings. We didn't own much, another side effect of constant movement, so the who gets what conversations were more emotional than practical. He took most of the tech gear, the monitors and cables, and backup drives. I kept the battered couch, the mismatched dishes, the bookshelf I'd always liked. We sold or donated the rest. At first, he was oddly pleasant. He sent me messages checking in, asking if I was okay. He made a few wistful comments about how maybe, someday, we'd find our way back to each other. Part of me wondered if he was right. If I was just going through some late 30s identity crisis I'd eventually grow out of. But as the weeks turned into months and I didn't crumble, didn't come running back, didn't beg for another chance, something in him shifted. The sweetness evaporated. The check-in texts stopped. The only time I heard from him was when he needed something. A document, a signature, information for the divorce. I'd like to say that didn't hurt, but it did. I'd spent a decade of my life with this person. We'd shared dreams and beds and bank accounts. We'd seen each other through illnesses and failures and small victories. To become a stranger to him so quickly was jarring, but it was also clarifying, because as the noise of our relationship faded, something else came into focus. Me. For the first time in my adult life, I lived alone. The apartment I moved into wasn't glamorous. It was a small, slightly shabby place in a not quite trendy neighborhood. The kitchen was outdated. The bathroom tiles were cracked. The windows let in a bit of a draft in winter. But it was mine. I signed the lease myself. I paid the rent myself. I bought a set of dishes I actually liked, white with a thin blue rim, and a cheap but cheerful rug for the living room. I spent an entire Saturday hanging art on the walls, measuring and remeasuring until the frames were exactly where I wanted them. I bought a plant, and miraculously didn't kill it. The first night I slept there, alone in my own bed, in my own room, in my own apartment, I lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of the building settling, the muffled hum of traffic outside. I expected to feel lonely. Instead, I felt safe. There were no boxes stacked in the corner, waiting to be filled. No half-made plans about where we'd go next. No undercurrent of someone else's anxiety pulsing through the walls. Just me. My things, my breath. I started to build a life. I kept my job for a while, grateful for the stability as I navigated the emotional upheaval of divorce. But with the chaos of my personal life settling, I found myself thinking more about my work, about what I wanted to do, not just what I could do. I'd always loved writing, even when the self-publishing bubble had burst and the income had become unreliable. The act of putting words together, of building worlds and characters and narratives, had never stopped feeling magical. So I went back to school. Not full-time, I still needed to pay the bills, but I enrolled in evening classes, inching my way toward a degree in a field that blended writing and helping others. It was terrifying to walk into a classroom in my late 30s, surrounded by people a decade younger, but it was also exhilarating. I made friends, real ones. There was the woman from my building who knocked on my door one day to ask if I'd accidentally gotten her mail, and who ended up staying for tea and becoming my regular Sunday walk partner. There was the guy from my evening class who shared my dark sense of humor and my love of terrible action movies. There was the couple I met at a local community event who invited me to their game night and never stopped including me. I became a regular at the coffee shop on the corner. The barista learned my name and my order. When I had a bad day, she'd slip an extra cookie into my bag with a conspiratorial wink. It sounds small, but after years of being uprooted, these tiny rituals were monumental. They were proof that I existed in a web of connections, however thin, that if I disappeared, someone would notice. I did therapy, a lot of it. I sat on a soft, neutral-colored couch in a quiet office and unpacked not just my marriage, but the years that came before it. The childhood that had taught me to equate love with volatility, with walking on eggshells, with constantly scanning for someone else's emotional weather so I could adjust myself accordingly. I started to see patterns. My parents had been chaotic in their own ways, emotionally unpredictable, financially unstable, prone to big gestures, followed by long stretches of neglect. I'd learned early that my needs were negotiable, that it was my job to adapt, to soothe, to make myself small in service of other people's big feelings. Meeting Mark had felt like being seen for the first time. He'd looked at me like I was capable, special, destined for more than I'd ever imagined. I'd latched onto that gaze like a lifeline. But in therapy, I began to understand that his visionary chaos had felt familiar too. The constant movement, the high highs and low lows, the way the ground was always shifting under my feet. That was the environment I'd been trained for. Of course I'd called it love. Of course I'd called it adventure. The alternative would have been admitting that I'd simply recreated what I knew, even when what I knew hurt me. That realization was brutal. It was also liberating, Because if my choices had been shaped by old wounds, that meant they weren't inevitable. I could choose differently. Slowly, I did. I learned to say no, to myself as much as to others. No, I couldn't pick up an extra shift if it meant skipping the one social event I'd been looking forward to all week. No, I couldn't drop everything to help a friend move if I was already exhausted. No, I didn't have to answer every text immediately or explain myself every time I needed space. I learned to ask for help, to tell a friend, I'm having a hard day, can we talk? To email a professor and say, I'm struggling with this assignment, can we meet? To admit to my therapist, I don't know who I am without someone else's dream to chase. I learned to sit with quiet. There were evenings when the apartment felt too big, the silence too loud, when I'd catch myself reaching for my phone to text my ex, to fill the emptiness with the familiar rhythm of our old conversations. Instead, I'd make tea, pick up a book, and remind myself that discomfort wasn't an emergency. In the midst of all this, life did what life always does. It threw curveballs. I got sick, not in a dramatic movie of the week way, but in a slow, grinding, confusing way. Fatigue that wouldn't lift, pain that came and went, a battery of tests, some of which hinted at something scary, others of which contradicted the first. There were a few months when the word cancer hovered in the air like a storm cloud, when I sat in sterile waiting rooms, hands clenched in my lap, and imagined all the ways my story could end. The old me, the one who had defined herself by her usefulness to others, would have panicked at the idea of being a burden. The newer me was still scared, but she wasn't alone. Friends drove me to appointments. Coworkers covered shifts when I needed to rest. My neighbor left homemade soup at my door. The barista at the coffee shop asked how I was doing and really listened to the answer. Even the receptionist at my doctor's office started greeting me by name. It was such a simple thing being recognized. But after a decade of being a stranger everywhere I went, of always being new or just passing through, it felt profound. In the end, the cancer scare turned out to be just that. A scare. There were issues to manage, health problems that would require ongoing attention, but the looming catastrophe receded. I remember walking out of the hospital after getting the all clear, blinking in the bright afternoon sun, and thinking, I'm so glad I built this life before this happened. Because I knew, deep in my bones, that if I'd still been with my ex, still moving, still uprooted, still living in service of his next big idea, I wouldn't have had this net, this community, this web of small, sturdy connections that held me when I was too tired to hold myself. Somewhere along the way, without fanfare, I fell in love again, not with a grand gesture or a whirlwind romance, with a friend, someone who had been in my orbit for a while, who had seen me at my worst and my best, who had watched me grow and made space for that growth. He, let's call him Daniel, was gentle in all the ways my ex had been intense, steady where my ex had been mercurial, curious about my dreams in a way that wasn't about how they could serve his. He listened, not the way you listen when you're waiting for your turn to talk, but the way you listen when you actually want to know what's going on inside someone else's head. He asked me questions no one had ever asked me before. What does a good day look like for you? What kind of work makes you feel useful? What does home mean to you? When I told him about my past, about the constant moves and the financial roller coaster and the way I'd lost myself in someone else's vision, he didn't swoop in with promises to fix everything. He just said, that sounds exhausting. I'm glad you got out. We took it slow. I was wary, understandably. I'd spent so long bending myself into shapes to fit someone else's life that the idea of joining mine with another person's again was terrifying. But he never asked me to contort. He made space for me to be who I was, and encouraged me when I stretched toward who I wanted to be. When I told him I wanted to keep my apartment, even if we eventually moved in together, my own little sanctuary, my own safety net, he didn't take it personally. He nodded and said, that makes sense. You spent a long time without a home. It's okay to want one that's just yours. We built something different, something rooted. We hosted game nights and potlucks. We learned our neighbors' names. We adopted a cat from the shelter, a grumpy old tabby who took a while to trust us and then, one day, decided our laps were acceptable thrones. I changed careers. The evening classes turned into a degree, which turned into a job in a field that combined my love of writing with my desire to help others. I won't go into specifics, but it's work that matters. Work that feels like more than chasing the next big payout. It doesn't pay as much as my ex's six-figure contracts used to, but it's steady, and it's enough. Combined with Daniel's income, we're comfortable. We save. We travel occasionally, not as escape, but as exploration, always knowing we have a home to come back to. I still write on the side, not with the frantic, desperate energy of my self-publishing days, but with a quieter, deeper joy. Some of it gets published, some of it doesn't. Either way, it's mine. I'm 42 now. When I look back at the woman I was at 35, sitting at a kitchen table with a dwindling savings account and a burned-out husband and a head full of half-formed dreams, I feel a fierce tenderness for her. She thought staying was the brave choice. That loyalty meant swallowing her own needs indefinitely. That leaving would prove she was selfish, or weak, or ungrateful. If I could sit across from her now, in some impossible time-bending coffee shop, this is what I'd tell her. Leave. Leave the man who calls your desire for stability settling while expecting you to finance his freedom. Leave the life that requires you to keep your heart in a cardboard box, always ready to move at a moment's notice. Leave the version of yourself that believes you are only as valuable as what you can do for someone else. You are not a supporting character in someone else's story. You are the protagonist of your own. You are capable of more than you think. You have already done hard things. You have already survived instability, uncertainty, disappointment. You can survive the pain of walking away, too. You are allowed to want a home. You are allowed to want a regular paycheck. You are allowed to want friends who live within a bus ride of you and a barista who knows your order. You are allowed to want a cat and a fish tank and art on the walls. You are allowed to want a life that is smaller on Instagram, but bigger in the ways that matter. You are allowed to choose yourself. Leaving my husband didn't magically solve all my problems. Life remained life. Messy, unpredictable, sometimes cruel. I faced illness, loss, grief. I had days when I questioned everything, when old patterns tried to drag me back into overfunctioning for others at the expense of myself. But I faced those things as a whole person, as someone rooted in a community, anchored in a home, supported by love that didn't require self-erasure as payment. I look around my living room as I write this. There's a plant in the corner that's somehow still alive. A cat asleep on the back of the couch, tail flicking in dreams. Photos on the wall. Me and my friends at a picnic. Me and Daniel on a hike. My parents holding up a lopsided cake they baked for my last birthday over video chat. On the shelf by the window, there's a small fish tank. Just a few fish, some plants, a little castle decoration that makes me smile every time I see it. It's not glamorous. It won't make anyone's jaw drop on social media. But it is undeniably home. And for a woman who spent a decade living out of boxes, that feels like the happiest ending I could have imagined.